You think westerns faded away with old black and white movies? Think again. In the 80s, comic book westerns were quietly reinventing what it meant to be a hero. Hollywood was busy making laser battles and car chases, but in the background, masked riders and roughneck gunslingers were getting a new shot at glory, with more grit, wild stories, and offbeat characters than anyone expected. So, how many of these wild comic book westerns have you ever heard of? You're about to find out, and trust me, this ride isn't what you expect. The Legend of the Lone Ranger, 1981. The 80s didn't just reboot the Lone Ranger, they tried to turn him into a blockbuster icon. The Legend of the Lone Ranger went all in, bringing the masked hero from comic strips and Dell Comics into the Hollywood spotlight with a huge budget and an even bigger risk. The film aimed to recapture the magic of the original, the mysterious masked man, his loyal friend Tonto, and that thundering cry of "Hi-Yo Silver." But things didn't go as planned. The studio gambled on a new face, Clinton Spilsbury, who quickly became a Hollywood mystery himself after the film flopped and he vanished from acting. Fans were already upset that the original Lone Ranger was banned from the premiere, and critics pounced on the movie's odd mix of old-school earnestness and 80s spectacle. But here's the twist. Over time, this so-called disaster grew a loyal cult following. People now watch for the wild stunts, the scenery, and Merle Haggard's sweeping theme song. The Lone Ranger's leap from comic book to the big screen wasn't perfect, but it's unforgettable in all the best and worst ways. It's a lesson in how big dreams and big risks sometimes create legends, even when the world isn't ready. The Lone Ranger Animated Series 1980-1982. Who says Saturday mornings can't be epic? In 1980, Filmation Studios brought the Lone Ranger back to life in an animated series that took direct inspiration from the classic comics. Forget old radio shows. This was all bright colors, crisp animation, and storylines that blended classic Western action with new adventures that felt fresh for a new generation. This wasn't just a nostalgia trip. The series leaned into the comic book roots, making the Lone Ranger and Tonto more than just cowboy icons. They were living legends in every episode. Every villain, from train robbers to gold-crazed outlaws, got the cartoon treatment, and every rescue felt larger than life. There was a sense of justice and loyalty that echoed straight from the comic strips, but was turbocharged for kids in the 80s. The result? A show that still feels sharp and energetic, with lessons about bravery, loyalty, and standing up for what's right. The animation style might look retro now, but back then it was cutting edge. The Lone Ranger animated series did more than keep the legend alive. It reminded a whole new audience why comic book westerns are pure adventure. Hi-Yo Silver indeed. Brave Star, The Legend, 1988. Just when you think westerns have played every card, along comes Brave Star, The Legend. Imagine the wildest mix of cowboy grit, comic book energy, and sci-fi gadgets ever squeezed into a single story, and you've got this animated TV movie. The year is 1988. Hollywood is all about lasers and robots, and someone at Filmation says, "Let's make a space western with a Native American lawman who channels animal powers and rides a robot horse." And somehow, it works. The movie, which ties directly into the Brave Star comics and toy line, isn't afraid to get weird. There are laser shootouts, supervillains, moral dilemmas, and a frontier planet called New Texas. Brave Star himself is more than just a sheriff. He's a hero who balances raw strength with real empathy. Every scene feels like a bold experiment, blending comic book storytelling with messages about courage and doing what's right. Brave Star. The legend didn't get the respect it deserved at the time, but now it stands as a cult classic, a blast of creative energy that redefined what a Western hero could be. If you think comic book westerns are stuck in the past, this movie proves they can blast right into the future and still deliver a punch. Marshall Brave Star, 1987-1988. You can't talk about 80s comic book westerns without mentioning Marshall Brave Star, the animated series that turned Saturday mornings into a showdown on the final frontier. This wasn't just a TV tie-in, it was a full-blown comic book adventure brought to life. complete with superpowers, futuristic gadgets, and villains that looked like they'd wandered off the pages of a graphic novel. Marshall Bravestar is part cowboy, part superhero, and all legend. He commands the strength of the bear, speed of the puma, and plenty of high-tech tools, battling everything from robotic outlaws to alien bandits. The show's creators pulled no punches. Storylines tackled real issues like bullying and personal courage, all without losing the wild, over-the-top action that made the comic tie-ins a hit. The animation was vivid, the pacing relentless, and the characters surprisingly deep for a kid's show. For every kid who watched, it was a crash course in why westerns and comics are such a perfect match. Marshall Bravestar showed you could be tough, smart, and kind, and still be the coolest hero on TV. Today, the show is a cult favorite for anyone who wants their westerns served with a side of laser blasts and heart. The New Adventures of Zorro 1981. Before superheroes ruled every screen, Zorro was the masked crusader who inspired them all. The New Adventures of Zorro in 1981 wasn't just another Saturday morning cartoon, it was a bold, high-action update for an icon who had already starred in comic strips, pulp magazines, and movie serials. This animated series made sure the old magic still sparkled, but with a fresh 80s twist. Here, Don Diego dons the mask to fight injustice in Spanish California, using his wit, his sword, and a never-ending supply of clever escapes. The show dialed up the color, energy, and cliffhanger spirit, mixing comic-style storytelling with wild, over-the-top villains. Zorro was part swashbuckler, part detective, and always a step ahead of the bad guys. For every kid glued to the TV, it felt like reading a living comic book, each episode packed with action, reversals, and a hero who never ran out of style. The New Adventures of Zorro proved that some heroes never get old, they just get cooler with every generation. This show delivered adventure, laughs, and just enough danger to make you wish for your own black mask and cape. Zorro and Son 1983. What happens when you mix classic swashbuckling with sitcom silliness? You get Zorro and Son, the 80s TV experiment that nobody saw coming. NBC decided the world needed more masked justice, but with a twist, what if Zorro was a dad, and his son was trying to follow in his famous footsteps? The result was a show that took every comic strip cliché, turned it on its head, and dared viewers not to laugh. The series brought Don Diego back to life, only this time he's dealing with a son who's just as eager to jump into the action, but twice as likely to trip over his own cape. The villains are over the top, the sword fights are pure slapstick, and the comedy sometimes borders on ridiculous. Yet, that's the charm. Zorro and Son embraces the absurdity, delivering wild chase scenes and plenty of comic book winks in every episode. Critics scratch their heads, but fans who grew up with Zorro comics found a soft spot for this cheerful spoof. Even if it didn't last long, the show proved that Western heroes can be funny, flawed, and relatable, and that there's always room for a little family drama in the wild world of masked Avengers. The Mask of Zorro 1984. Before Antonio Banderas ever donned the mask, Zorro was carving his Z across TV screens in a colorful animated special that channeled the bold lines and daring escapades of his comic book roots. The Mask of Zorro 1984 took everything fans loved about the classic strips, dynamic swordplay, clever escapes, and outlandish villains, and poured it into a compact, high-energy cartoon. The animation is a visual love letter to the comics, with Zorro dashing through moonlit rooftops, dodging traps, and outsmarting the bumbling local soldiers. The action never lets up, and neither does the humor. The special even finds time for the masked hero's signature charm and a few one-liners that would make any comic book fan grin. It wasn't a massive hit, but for kids in the 80s, this special was a goldmine. It kept Zorro's legend fresh and accessible, reminding everyone that the hero's true power lies not in brute force, but in brains and bravery. If you ever wondered what a comic book could look like in motion, The Mask of Zorro delivered the answer: fast, fun, and unforgettable. The Adventures of the American Rabbit, 1986. Only in the 80s could a piano-playing rabbit become a Western superhero and get his own animated movie, no less. The Adventures of the American Rabbit took the idea of comic book heroics to a whole new level. Here, Rob Rabbit transforms into the red, white, and blue American rabbit, cape billowing, ready to defend the innocent and keep peace on the frontier. But this isn't just a standard cowboy tale. The movie throws in a gang of villainous jackals, a talking duck with a trumpet, and a Wild West setting that feels more like a comic fever dream than classic Americana. Rob's transformation from shy musician to action hero is pure comic book magic, and every chase, pratfall, and musical number feels like a wink to fans who love their stories a little weird. Critics didn't know what to make of it, but for kids glued to Saturday morning cartoons, American Rabbit was something new and wild. It's the only Western where the hero might break into song between gunfights, and honestly, that's part of its charm. This movie proved that the American spirit of comic book Westerns is big enough to include anyone, even a rabbit with nerves of steel. Jonah Hex, 1980. Jonah Hex doesn't care if he's out of place. He'll ride right into the middle of a superhero cartoon and steal the show. In the 1980s, DC's scarred bounty hunter galloped from his gritty comic books into the bright, cheerful world of Super Friends and Superpowers animated specials. He looked like he wandered in from a different universe, and honestly, that's exactly what made him awesome. Hex brought a dose of real Wild West edge to the cartoons, often showing up in time travel episodes or wild crossover events. He was always quick on the draw, blunt with his words, and totally unafraid of getting his hands dirty, even when standing next to costumed heroes with capes and laser eyes. For viewers used to Superman's clean-cut heroics, Hex was a shot of rough-and-tumble reality, never apologizing for his scars or his attitude. The animated appearances didn't last long, but they were enough to cement Jonah Hex as a comic book Western icon who could hold his own against anyone. If you ever doubted the staying power of a true Western anti-hero, just watch Hex outgun half the Justice League, no mask required. Jesse James, 1980. Before he became an outlaw legend in the movies, Jesse James was tearing up the comic pages, especially in Marvel's Western line, where his adventures ranged from high-stakes heists to daring escapes and tense showdowns. In the 1980s, his stories were revived for a new generation through animated storybooks and TV educational vignettes aimed at American kids hungry for action and history. The Jesse James adaptations didn't glorify crime. They gave viewers a wild ride through comic book history, painting Jesse as a complex anti-hero with guts, grit, and a knack for dodging trouble. These short, punchy segments were a window into the golden era of Western comics, packed with high-speed train chases, frontier justice, and those classic moments where Jesse had to decide whether to run, fight, or stand up for something bigger than himself. Kids might not have found the old Marvel comics on the spinner rack, but the 80s adaptations made sure the legend of Jesse James stayed alive. In a world full of superheroes, this Western anti-hero proved you don't need a mask or cape to be unforgettable. Sometimes all it takes is a bold move and a will to survive. The Phantom 2040 pilot, 1989-1990. Who says the Old West can't go high-tech? The Phantom 2040 pilot snuck in at the very end of the 80s, giving America's classic Masked Avenger a futuristic facelift. While the Phantom is most famous for his jungle adventures, the comic strip and its many American adaptations often blended Western grit with pulp heroics. This pilot took all that, dialed it to 11, and sent the Phantom on a neon-soaked ride through a cyberpunk world where lawmen still ride alone, just on motorcycles instead of horses. Set in a city that feels half frontier, half Blade Runner, the pilot dropped the ghost who walks into high-tech trouble. Villains were everywhere, but the Phantom kept his cool, using wits, gadgets, and that iconic purple suit to keep order. The DNA of the Western was everywhere. Lone hero, wild territory, big risks, and no backup. The animation was fast, stylized, and aimed squarely at kids who'd grown up on action comics. While it only teased the full series that would take off in the 90s, the Phantom 2040 pilot showed that even a hero born in newspaper strips could stay relevant in the MTV era. It's a time capsule of how American comic book westerns kept evolving, never afraid to go wild or weird or straight into the future. Red Ryder 1980. Long before superheroes ruled Saturday mornings, Red Ryder was the cowboy king of the comic pages. By the 1980s, new adventures were rare, but the legend was far from over. Enter the syndicated TV and VHS re-edits. American producers took classic Red Ryder serials, spruced them up for the video age, and blasted them out to a new generation who'd never set foot in a comic book shop. These re-edits were like a best-of album for Red Ryder. The sharpest shootouts, the quickest wit, and the biggest dust-ups, all trimmed for fast-paced viewing. Fans got a crash course in what made Red Ryder special: a straight-shooting cowboy with a strict code, a loyal sidekick, and a knack for finding trouble in the wildest corners of the West. Even in rerun form, Red Ryder showed how comic book westerns could still pack a punch, decades after their heyday. The VHS boom meant kids across the country suddenly had access to the old-school roots of Western comics. Red Ryder's adventures became cult favorites, inspiring backyard games, new comic readers, and a healthy respect for the timeless draw of a well-told Western yarn. The Lone Ranger VHS repackaged adventures 1980. 80s nostalgia wasn't just about new cartoons. It was also about dusting off old legends and giving them a new shine. The Lone Ranger VHS repackaged adventures did exactly that, editing together classic TV episodes and serials for a new wave of viewers who wanted their heroes bold, brave, and just a little bit mysterious. This wasn't just lazy recycling. The VHS tapes often included newly written introductions, modern music stings, and creative re-edits to keep things snappy. The result? A fresh experience that made the Lone Ranger feel just as vital in the 80s as he did back when he first rode out of the comic strips. Hi-Yo Silver once again echoed through living rooms across America, and a whole new audience learned the legend, mask, horse, friendship, and all. For every kid who popped a tape into the VCR, these adventures were a bridge to the comic book and serial roots that started it all. The Lone Ranger's unbreakable sense of justice and friendship never goes out of style, and thanks to some creative re-editing, he got to ride again, loud and proud, right into the home video era. Zorro, Munavotain. If there's one thing the 80s loved, it was remixing a classic. Disney's Zorro, already a staple from decades past, got the syndicated treatment in the 1980s with TV re-edits and reruns that pulled directly from the masked hero's comic strip roots. These weren't just repeats, they were reimagined for a new audience, cut together with tighter storytelling, new voiceovers, and sometimes even added color sequences. Suddenly, a whole generation who'd only seen Zorro in old comic books or newspaper strips got to see him leap, slash, and wisecrack his way through trouble on primetime TV. Disney made sure every episode kept the comic book flair, dramatic shadows, exaggerated villains, and the constant sense that Zorro was always one clever step ahead. The syndicated run didn't just revive interest in Zorro. It proved that comic book westerns can stay fresh, fun, and relevant, decade after decade. Whether on the page or the screen, Zorro's brand of smart heroism and dashing rebellion never gets old, and the 80s made sure his legend kept growing. The Lone Ranger and the Lost City of Gold 1980. Every hero needs a big adventure, and for the Lone Ranger, that came roaring back in the 80s with the VHS re-release of The Lone Ranger and the Lost City of Gold. Originally a late 50s film inspired by the comic strips and TV shows, this movie found new life and a new audience when American home video stores put it back on their shelves. The film is pure comic book western, an ancient map, a hidden treasure, masked villains, and enough showdowns to fill a dozen Saturday mornings. The Lone Ranger and Tonto never break character, never lose their cool, and never let injustice win, no matter how wild things get. The VHS re-release brought the movie's action, humor, and classic comic book values to living rooms all over America, sparking a revival for the franchise, just as westerns were becoming rare on TV. This re-release wasn't just nostalgia, it was a reminder of how much fun comic book westerns could be. In a world full of changing tastes, The Lone Ranger proved that some stories are just too good to stay buried for long. Rawhide 1980. Marvel Comics tried their hand at just about every genre, and with Rawhide Kid, they delivered a Western hero with more swagger and heart than most gunslingers. By the 80s, Rawhide Kid stories had become collector's items, but the TV world wasn't done yet. Retrospective specials and documentary-style TV segments dusted off these comic adventures, showcasing clips, classic artwork, and sometimes animated snippets for audiences who thought Westerns were history. Rawhide's tales were pure comic book gold, quick-draw showdowns, impossible escapes, and a loner who always stood up for the underdog. The 80s segments brought his legacy back into the spotlight, sometimes as animated storybook features or special TV segments that pulled the best of Marvel's Western world right onto the screen. No matter the format, Rawhide proved that Westerns could be snappy, funny, and as bold as any superhero saga. Even without a full series reboot, the character stayed alive through clever reimaginings and callbacks, reminding everyone that the Wild West was never really that far away. For comic fans, it was proof that great Western heroes just need the right moment to ride back into view. Hopalong Cassidy. Long before Batman or Spider-Man, there was Hopalong Cassidy, one of America's first true comic book cowboys. By the 1980s, his old film serials and TV shows, based on comic strip adventures and countless tie-in stories, were given new life through syndicated edits. TV channels spliced together the best action scenes and classic moral lessons, making sure Hopalong's steady code of justice could still inspire a new generation. What set Hopalong apart wasn't just his quick trigger or unflappable hat, it was his ability to turn every brawl and chase into a lesson about fairness, loyalty, and sticking up for your friends. The comic origins were never far from the surface. Every hero's entrance, every daring escape, felt pulled from a panel with bold lines and simple, timeless truths. These 1980s reruns weren't just background noise. They were a reminder that the Western comic book hero could still teach, thrill, and charm, even in a world obsessed with ninjas and neon. Hopalong Cassidy's syndicated comeback kept his legend alive, proving that a good cowboy and a good comic never goes out of style. Bat Masterson. Some heroes are born in the comics, others leap out of history and become comic book icons. Bat Masterson was both. Starting as a real-life lawman, he found a second career as a comic strip star, and in the 1980s, syndicated reruns of his TV show brought the legend back with a vengeance. American networks, hungry for wholesome westerns, re-edited the classic episodes to highlight the show's comic strip style, sharp dialogue, bigger-than-life standoffs, and a hero whose wit was as fast as his gun. The comic connection was always front and center. Bat was known for his signature cane, dapper suit, and clever tricks, all of which made for great visual storytelling on the page and on TV. The 80s reruns became a crash course in Western heroics for kids who'd missed the original run, delivering Bat's old-school charm and comic book panache in quick, bingeable chunks. What's the takeaway? Whether fighting outlaws or con men, Bat Masterson made it clear that brains and courage could take you further than bullets. Even decades after his comic debut, Bat was still the coolest cat in the saloon, thanks to the power of TV and a little comic book magic. Tumbleweeds. If your idea of westerns is all grit and no giggles, you've never met Tumbleweeds. This long-running comic strip, famous for poking fun at frontier life, got its own animated special in the 80s. Suddenly, the offbeat world of dusty deserts, clueless cowboys, and talking horses was alive and kicking on American TV. The Tumbleweed special brought the strip's quirky humor to life, mixing slapstick gags, one-liners, and enough comic confusion to keep even the rowdiest outlaw in stitches. The characters, hapless sheriff, bandit with more brains than brawn, and that ever-rolling tumbleweed felt like old friends who'd wandered straight out of a Sunday newspaper and onto the screen. For comic book Western fans, this special was a breath of fresh air, a reminder that you could love the genre without taking it too seriously. Tumbleweeds proved that the West could be just as funny as it was fierce, and that sometimes, laughter is the best way to survive a showdown. Casey Ruggles. Casey Ruggles was the cowboy hero that almost every American comic fan of the 50s and 60s grew up reading. By the 80s, his classic adventures, full of gold rush chaos, dangerous outlaws, and the drama of the Old West, were revived for a new generation in the form of radio and TV repack specials. Producers stitched together old comic strip panels, narration, and music to create new mini-episodes that kept the spirit of the comic alive. The result? A unique blend of nostalgia and innovation. Casey's adventures could be experienced in classrooms, on public TV, or even as vinyl record stories, each adaptation introducing his brand of steady courage and humor to kids who might never have picked up a newspaper. It was comic book Western storytelling at its most resourceful, using every tool available to keep the legend riding high. These repack specials showed that no matter how much time passes, a good Western story and a good comic hero will always find a new way to ride into town. For Casey Ruggles, the adventure was never over. It just kept finding new trails. The Cisco Kid. Before there were superheroes with million-dollar gadgets, there was the Cisco Kid, a smooth-talking, fast-riding cowboy who made justice look easy. In the 80s, Cisco's old TV episodes, built on a foundation of wildly popular American comic strips and pulp tales, were repackaged for syndication. Every rerun was a portal to high adventure, with Cisco and his sidekick Pancho outwitting outlaws, charming townsfolk, and riding off into the sunset with a smile. The show's comic book roots were always front and center. Cisco's daring escapes, punchy one-liners, and comic timing made every episode feel like a living strip from the funny pages. The 80s reruns brought that unique blend of action and humor to a new audience who might never have cracked open a comic but couldn't resist Cisco's swagger on screen. For many, Cisco Kid was the first comic Western hero they ever rooted for, proof that style, wit, and a strong sense of right can outshine even the wildest shootouts. The Outlaw Kid. Marvel's The Outlaw Kid rode the comic book range for decades, but in the 80s, the character got a new lease on life through animated storybooks and TV educational segments. These mini-episodes brought Outlaw Kid's adventures into classrooms and living rooms, introducing a masked cowboy with a mysterious past and a deep code of justice. Each animated storybook dropped kids right into the thick of frontier trouble, bank robberies, ambushes, and epic horse chases, told with comic book flair. Outlaw Kid wasn't just another gunslinger, he was a true masked hero, battling for the underdog and never backing down from a fight, no matter the odds. The 80s adaptations, though short and sweet, captured the heart of the comics: action, suspense, and a sense that in the Wild West, doing the right thing always meant taking a risk. If you discovered Outlaw Kid on TV or in a storybook, you got a taste of classic Western storytelling. No capes, just courage and a steady aim. Sometimes that's all you need to make a legend. Kid Colt. Last but never least, Kid Colt galloped out of Marvel's Western comics and into the world of 80s animated storybooks and TV vignettes. These bite-sized adventures packed all the dust, danger, and redemption arcs of the classic comic right into after-school specials and educational broadcasts. Kid Colt was always on the run, wrongly accused but determined to clear his name, making him one of the most relatable Western heroes ever drawn. The storybook animations took the best parts of the comics, Colt's wild rides, his quick-draw skills, and his refusal to ever quit, and set them loose for a new generation. You didn't need to buy a comic to get hooked. Just one mini-episode was enough to understand why Kid Colt was a staple of American Western lore. These short features may not have had blockbuster budgets, but they delivered big on heart, grit, and the pure thrill of a hero's journey. For every viewer who found Kid Colt in the 80s, the message was clear. Sometimes the real Western isn't about the gold or the guns. It's about never letting go of what's right, no matter how hard the ride. So, did you think comic book Westerns rode off for good? These 23 adaptations prove the spirit of the frontier never really faded. It just traded horses for new heroes and new screens. Which of these wild Western legends would you bring back for another round? Drop your thoughts below, hit subscribe for more hidden movie history, and share this with someone who thinks cowboys belong in the past. The truth? The next great adventure is always just a page or a tape away.